Yaffy is here today to not only share her Aliyah experience, but to share another side of a story of racism, anti Semitism, and just life in Israel in general. Yaffy, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Of
I'm
course,
excited to
thank
do
you.
this.
So I know that you're in school right now. Can you tell us about how, like, when did you start going to school? I know, like, there was a break in between. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I actually started going to school a while ago. When I first came to Israel, I made Aliyah right after my year in Israel, right after SEM. I went to Nishmat, for anyone who wanted to know. Great place.
Nice.
And when I was very much so still in my American mindset of like, you have a plan, you have your 5-year plan, and you stick to it. You don't deviate no matter what. And I kind of plowed ahead with that. And that's not the way that life works in Israel.
Yeah.
It's very man plans, God laughs. That's a lesson you learned very well here. And so when I was living in the States, I had always thought that I'd wanted to study medicine. And so that was kind of the plan that I started going ahead with. And midway through the preparatory program to start studying medicine at Hebrew University, I realized that I actually didn't quite like the differences in lifestyle and a lot of things that doctors have in Israel in comparison to what I had seen in America. So I essentially decided to stop and step back and work for a few years, because the thing that I was hearing from my Israeli friends is that, honey, you're not in America. Like, switching between degrees is not like a casual thing that people do. Because most of the degrees that you study in Israel, like my husband right now is studying engineering, so he's literally only taking math and physics. Like, that's it, like nothing else. There's no like electives. There's no like, oh, you need to take like a general math course that has nothing to do with engineering. Like, you literally only do, it's like tunnel vision, like only whatever you're doing, that's the only thing you get to touch. And they were like, don't waste time and money right now starting to study something that you won't be able to get credits from or use, or get very little credit from. So I took their advice and I stopped for a few years. I also got married during that time and everything, so it ended up being for the best. We weren't living in Jerusalem also, and my husband was in the army then. And yeah, I just worked, and my husband got out of the army not this past summer now, but the previous summer before then. And we had been planning for about almost all 5 years of him being in the army, the big like post-army trip, Tiyul Shichur, as they say in Israel. And we wanted to do ours in South America. My mother is from Panama, so I was very excited to have like a Latino heritage kind of like backpacking culture trip. And we went on that, and we backpacked for about 5 months. Then COVID happened and we ended up getting stuck in America, but everything ended up being a blessing. And so now we finally came back at the end of this past summer now in August. And I went back to school and I'm studying computer science now.
Oh, wonderful. So I think that's what I was perceiving from you, from your page. I thought you just started school because before that, I didn't know you were in school. I think you just took a big break. So let's just backtrack a little bit. What brought you to Israel to begin with? Why did you decide to go to seminary? Where are you from? Let's go back.
Backtrack.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was born and raised in Hollywood, Florida. It's a really awesome community, and that was like the four walls that I pretty much only knew my whole life. And like the standard, like I'm nothing special in terms of like the choices I made coming to Israel, because like everyone goes to Israel. Out of my grade of like close to 90 kids, I think like maybe 10 kids didn't come for a year in Israel. And it's like, most high schools will have like a college guidance counselor that will like help you through the ropes of like, the applications and interviews and what you should be doing and preparing. And a lot of schools, like my school, also have like a SEM/yeshiva guidance counselor. So like we had that as well. And SEM is expensive. And like I said, I thought that I'd wanted to be a doctor then. And I was like, that's a long haul and that's going to mean a lot of student loans. And I was like, I grew up from like, I don't need to go to SEM. Like that was kind of how I perceived seminary. I was like, oh, it's like the place where people go and either like they waste a year partying, or like they go and like they flip out. And like I saw both things as like, oh, like that's not me. Like I know myself, because everyone knows exactly who they are at 18, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I was like, yeah, I don't need to go to STEM. My parents really wanted me to go, even though it was going to be expensive. All of my friends obviously wanted me to go. And Mipore Sham, it ended up being that I was like, I'm not going to STEM. I'm just going to go straight to college. And like everyone in my world, like friends, parents, like teachers were like, Yaffy, you really have to go to seminary. You really should go. And like, my friend's dad actually was the one who like tipped the scale for me. He said to me, he was like, look, putting religion aside, this year is probably going to be the last major year of your life that you can 100% be selfish. He's like, don't look at it from like a classic perspective. Look at it from the perspective of, this is probably the last year that rent will be paid for you, food will be fully paid for you, all these things. You won't have to worry about school or bills or job or like, you know, any of that. And he's like, go for it. He's like, I grew so much on that year. You learned so much about yourself. You're so young, do it. And I ended up doing it, and I essentially had no idea where I was going to go or what I was going to do. All of my siblings are a lot older than me, and they didn't go for gap year programs in Israel anyhow. So
You
I
were the
had no
first one.
Yeah, I was the first one. I had no one to like, you know, like a lot of my friends, like, oh, my sister went to Harova. She said it's this. Like my brother went to like Oraita. He said it. It's like I had no one to have those things from. And so when I went in for my my like meeting with like our SEM Yeshiva guidance counselor teacher, she essentially was like, okay, you don't know what you want. Tell me what's your favorite subject in Limudei Kodesh. And I said, Gemara. My high school offered a Gemara class that out of the entire high school, only about like 5 girls took.
Yeah.
It was not very popular. It was not because I was so smart or so cool at all. It was more that I was failing Toshba and I really did not like it. So they were like, okay, here's another option. If you're not doing well in Toshba, you probably won't do well in Gemara, but go for it. And it ended up being fantastic for me. Like it was such like a change, and like I guess like I needed to learn halacha like from that way as opposed to like the toshba kind of angle. And so I told her Gemara, and she was like, well, if you like Gemara, here are the top 3 seminaries for girls that teach Gemara properly. And so she said, maybe you should look into them. I know that you're not so interested, but try. And as I said, man plans, God laughs, and I ended up at Nishmat. And yeah, my year in Israel was a little bit funny, not just because of that whole start of, oh, I wasn't going to go, but I didn't realize, if anyone from Nishmat hears this, they're going to laugh at me, but I didn't realize that Nishmat was an Israeli seminary. A lot of seminaries in Israel that have Israelis and Americans will often have like pretty split programs, you know, like Harova, for example, both has Israelis and Americans, but the programs are pretty split. They're pretty different. If you want to have contact with Israelis or with Americans, you totally can, but they're not like hand in hand. And I remember when I got, because all of the teachers were in Israel, I got a call from like the sort of Rosh Yeshiva of my program at Nishmat. And like he called and he's like, hi, shalom, zot Yaffy Israel. And I was like, like, what? And he's like, switch to English. He's like, I'm calling for your interview, you know? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, but we're going to speak in Hebrew. They told you that, right? And I was like, yeah, totally. And I was like, but just out of curiosity, like, why are we going to speak in Hebrew? And he's like, it's an Israeli seminary. Like it's an Israeli midrasha. Like your classes are going to be in Hebrew. You're going to be learning with Israelis. Like if your Hebrew level isn't like, you know, up to snuff, so to speak, then like we either need to get it there or like you might want to think of a different place. So I had no idea when I applied that it was Israeli.
How was your Hebrew?
It was just like everyone else's Hebrew. It was not great.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I definitely had to get serious about it before going. But if I had known that it was Israeli, to be honest, I almost 100% would not have applied. I probably would have looked for a program that was all English speakers or very, very separate and had like no contact with Israelis. But once again, man plans, God laughs. And it was really just like the best decision for me. I had an incredible time. in all aspects of life. And the big thing that I had that year, because our program was mixed with Israelis, was that for Shabbos's, a lot of like the classic places that a lot of my friends were going to, I wasn't going to. And at first I was really jealous. I was like, wait, I want to go to that place. Like all my friends are getting to go there. Like I want to go there as well. But I remember like our first out Shabbat, they took us to a yeshuv Neve Tzuf. I had no idea what a yeshuv was. Like literally the word yeshuv meant nothing to me. I thought that the place that we were in was called yeshuv. And I remember talking to one of the Israelis at the end of Shabbos, because it would have been physically the area is gorgeous, but just like everything else, like emotionally, the environment, like it was such a beautiful Shabbos. And I was like, what's this place called? It's so beautiful. And she's like, this yeshuv is called Neve Tzuf in Hebrew to me. And I was like, wow, yeshuv is really beautiful. And she's like, like looked at me like I was crazy. But yeah, so we saw a lot of different places, or a little bit off the beaten track for an American at least.
Yeah.
And it really opened my eyes to the fact that the perception that 18-year-old me had of Israel, and more importantly Israelis, was really not the case.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that whatever Israelis I had met up until now in America totally embodied and represented Israeli society and culture, and that is so false. It is so rich and varied in all aspects, religiously, like culturally, socially, everything. And it really opened my eyes, and I just started recognizing Aliyah was something that I was never interested in ever, to the point where like so many of my good friends in high school were part of like APAC and all of that, and they would always try to convince me and like totally Zioni and totally love Israel. Like, love Israel from my couch kind of vibes.
Yeah.
And I just, the more we traveled that year, and the more I met people, and the more I was exposed to different pockets of Israeli culture. And that was probably the biggest thing that like was a turnover for me, that I did travel so much. The more I started to recognize that there are certain in like non-tangible values and things about life and society here that I felt like no matter what, I wouldn't be able to bring back with me to America. And I just realized that I wanted those things to be a part of my future. And yeah, so I just had an epiphany moment my last week of SEM, and I called my parents and I was like, I'm moving here. And they were like, okay.
Was it that easy? And it was that easy to just say.
It really was that easy for me. Yeah.
What? Say that again?
My parents were very supportive. I said it really was that easy for me. I was super lucky. A lot of my friends I know did not have it that easy, and my parents were not the norm in this. They were very sad, but also elated at the same time, and they were super supportive, and they were like, if you have a plan and you know what you're going to do and you have somewhat of structure, we trust you, go for it. And best decision I ever made.
That's so interesting. I feel like maybe if you went to the all-American seminary and you weren't exposed to different aspects of Israeli life, and you didn't travel to all these underground places that people aren't really exposed to, you probably wouldn't have had the same enthusiasm and pull to like be like, this place is for me. I feel it. So do you think that the American seminaries and the gap year students, they're getting a real taste of Israel?
I think they're getting a real taste of Israel for sure. I just don't know that they're getting a full taste of Israel, I think is how I'd put it. Like, I think for sure, like the experiences that are more typical for like Shabbosim and like trips and Tiulim and whatnot are definitely still Israel. But I think that it's hard to realize until you've seen like the bigger picture, how small of a picture you're sometimes seeing. And I've dragged many of my friends over the years to like places that for me now feel very like normal and very part of the norm, but for them are very off the beaten track. And it's not always for them. Sometimes they're like, this is awesome, but not for me. And other times, like myself, they're like, whoa, I had no idea that this existed in Israel. I was convinced that Israel was XYZ. I had no idea that people could live like this, that there are people who are religious like this, that there are people who work like this, whatever it is.
Right. Okay, so you identify obviously as Jewish. but you also identify as Black. You said your mom is from Panama, and where's your
Yeah.
father from?
So my dad's a New Yorker,
Okay.
very non-exotic place. My dad is a New Yorker, born and bred, and my father was an African American man. My mother's Latina, so I identify both as like Black and Latina, biracial. And yeah, my parents were very into my knowing and understanding their heritage and their culture growing up, and they really wanted to make sure that that was an important part of my upbringing.
Right.
That the Jewish bubble, that can often be very all-encompassing, wasn't the only thing that I ever knew, and that even if it was from within our home, that I got to know a little bit about their various backgrounds.
That's beautiful. And how did you feel growing up in Hollywood, Florida, as a Latina and as an African American and a Jew? And also, like, this is like a two-sided question. How did you experience that in Hollywood and then coming to Israel? How was that different?
Yeah.
Let's start with Hollywood,
So
Florida.
So yeah, so like I said, Hollywood was the place that I was like born and raised into. So I really didn't know anything else. Um, and that was something that my father Dafka really tried to combat growing up. Because the Jewish community and the frum world was like home from day one. So like there was no need to like work on that. It's sort of like my husband and I talk about languages all the time. My husband also speaks English, but we live here in Israel. So we talk all the time about how like one day when we have children, we want to make sure that we speak English inside the house because our children will be growing up in Israel. You know, like that's going to be the world that they know. So like we're not concerned about like them learning Hebrew, but we do want to make sure that their English is going to be strong. So that was kind of like my dad's approach to things. Like I grew up very much so in the Jewish community in Hollywood. So like that was like an automatic part of my identity. Like if
Right.
anything, I would say that's like the main part of my identity, you know?
Mhm.
Um, but the first of all, like my father always made sure to have people and friends of all walks of life and of all backgrounds, creeds, races, religions coming over all the time. Our house was also the kind of house that, like, we always had guests over for Shabbos. Sometimes they weren't Jewish. So growing up from a young age, I definitely was exposed to a lot of different people, and many of those people were either Latino or Black like myself, or both. And even when I was young, my father went as far as, when I was going to day camp still in the summer, he would send me to, like, you know, the local boys and girls camp and whatnot. And he would like make sure that I was exposed to people outside of the Jewish community who in no
Yeah.
way were affiliated or Jewish at all, so that I would get to know a little bit peers my age who perhaps didn't share the religion that I had, but shared other outward appearances. Because growing up in the Jewish community in Hollywood, when I was a kid at least, all of my friends were Caucasian. I didn't have any friends who looked like me, or who had hair like me or anything like that. Yeah, all in all, inside my community itself, like I didn't struggle with any of like my different identities. They didn't feel like conflicting identities because my parents had been a part of the community for many years before I was born.
Mm.
So there was no need to like prove myself or like any questioning of like who I was or where I came from or anything, which is also a huge bracha because I know
That's a
that
huge
many
blessing.
people, yeah, many people of color who are Jews of color oftentimes struggle inside Jewish communities finding acceptance. Not always, but I know that that is something that's very common. So I personally never had to deal with that in my community. It was more out of my community or people who were new to the community that I'd sometimes have run-ins with, so to speak.
Mm.
But yeah,
Mhm.
growing up in the community itself, it was always a very safe place for me.
Even though you were the only one who is not white, you still felt
Yeah.
accepted and part of the community because your parents were there for years before and they were already like comfortable there.
Yeah, I do also think that it's important to say that as a child, I'm sure that there was a lot that went over my head, you know, that perhaps didn't pass over my parents' head. Like something that I've talked about before, in other like
Yeah.
podcasts and whatnot, is that like when I was young in kindergarten, um, that there's like the classic school in Hollywood that most people in the community, or a lot of people in the community, send their kids to, and that was the school that I grew up going to. And at the time, now they do, but at the time, in the early 2000s, they did not have a gifted or honors track for kindergarteners. I'm laughing saying this because this is like such a non-Israeli thing. Like, what God in Israel would have a track for 5-year-olds, but whatever.
Right.
And my parents had me evaluated, and they wanted me placed into an honors track. They felt that things were moving a little too slowly for me, and my school didn't have that at the time. And so my school recommended perhaps sending me to a nearby school in Miami that did have that. And when I switched to that school, also another private Jewish day school, when I switched to that school in Miami, I came home one day and I told my mother how someone, and this girl, just for reference, she wasn't like an enemy. She was actually one of my closest friends in the class. So like, I don't think this was like like anything kind of like meant to be rude. Right. But I told my mom how the teacher sent home a note about the fact that this other girl had asked the teacher in front of everyone very angrily why I was being pulled out, because they would pull out like the 5 gifted kids from the class and they would take us all to a different classroom. And she was like, why does Yaffy get pulled out for gifted? I don't understand why she goes and I don't. Everyone knows that Black people can't read. So that like, I only remember that story because I remember my parents being so upset about it, you know, like, I think that there are probably a lot of things that perhaps did occur that totally went over my head that I didn't really recognize or notice.
Yeah. You're also in a new environment. It wasn't like you were in Hollywood, Florida, in your cushion where you knew everybody. You went to a new school in Miami where you were a new person.
Yeah.
You know, that people didn't know you. So that's probably why you experienced that.
Yeah. But I think something like that, though, has nothing to do with my Judaism. That has to do purely with the color of my skin, you know? Like young girl, like, was taught clearly either in her home or in whatever environment, like, somehow she was taught the message that, like, there's no reality, or where it would be preposterous that someone who's Black would be in a level higher than her, you know? And that could have happened hypothetically anywhere. But yeah, no, definitely, like, I don't have negative memories from the community I have growing up. I have very fond memories. The community is still very much a home for me till today. And yeah, like I said, it was more whenever I left the community that I would like bump into things. But my father was a very proud Black man. And so as a result, from a young age, when I very much was not appreciative, today I am, but when I very much was not appreciative and didn't like it, he very much drilled into my head not to be ashamed of myself. That like, okay, like, so your skin is different, like, so what? Like, you know, like, in a reverse like scenario, like, your friend who's Caucasian would be the one who are different, you know? Like, if we live 20 minutes away in Dania, where like the population at the time when I was younger was a lot more African American, like, okay, then your friends would be the odd ones out. Like, so what? Like, what does it matter, you know? Like, it doesn't matter. And if it matters to other people, then like, that's on them. That's not on you.
Right. Wow, this message is quite different from the message that we're receiving nowadays. I feel like today, I don't know if you can still see me.
Yeah, I see you. I see you.
Okay, great. I just feel like nowadays, since this whole BLM movement that's been going on, the emphasis is not that we should be colorblind. It's not that we should not see color. I feel that the BLM movements and certain Black rights moves, Black rights groups encourage us to see color and like putting an emphasis on like Black identity, and in some instances promote sort of like a voluntary segregation. Do you feel like, what do you feel like is the right approach? Because, you know, Martin Luther King had a dream that one day there's going to be a day that people won't see color anymore. Instead, they'll see character. Do you feel like that's what's going on nowadays? And what's the right approach?
So obviously what's the right approach is going to be very varied. Different people have very strong opinions about this. I think there's a really important distinction to make, though. I think the idea of not seeing color in a negative aspect is positive. As in, like, for the same example of like my friend who automatically equated dark skin less smart, you know, like
Yeah.
I think that we should be able to, yes, look at people and not judge them based off of, not judge them negatively, I mean, based
Right.
off of skin color. So in that aspect, I do think that not seeing color is great. But I think that I, and once again, I can't speak for the Black Lives Matter movement because I didn't create it. Like, you know, like I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not part of running anything with it. But I can speak at least for like the generational push that I'm hearing. Lots of people of color, not just Black people, like
Yeah.
Latinos, like Indians, like people of all walks of life from all different countries on the globe who very clearly are not Caucasian, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that the push of seeing color is not to say, oh, we're different, you know, like my skin is brown, your skin is white, we're different, you know. It's not to say we're different, it's to say recognize the things that come along with me. It's in the
Mhm.
same way that I think we as Jews like wouldn't appreciate it if people were like, let's not see religion, you know, like
Mhm.
in a negative aspect, let's not see religion. Don't look at me and see that I'm Jewish because of my sheitel and assume that I have money and that I'm a money
Yeah.
miser and I'm going to steal from you. But in the positive aspect, do recognize my Jewishness. Recognize that I am part of a religion that is powerful and strong and has so much to offer to the world, even if you're not going to be a Jew. I have such a rich culture and history that I come from. And
Yeah.
to not recognize that is wrong, you know?
That's
And on the
correct.
flip side, when it comes to problems, not recognizing that is dangerous, you know?
Right.
When I have friends who aren't Jewish who have a difficult time acknowledging or hearing that there's anti-Semitism in the world today, that would be them not being willing to recognize my Jewishness, you know? They see me as, oh, Yaffy, their friend, but not Yaffy, their friend who is Jewish. Like, I am
Mhm.
their friend, but I am also very much so a strong and proud Jewish woman. And that is precisely how I feel about being Black. Don't look at my skin color and then stop there. If you're making negative associations, my skin color is different than them, not because it's about my skin and we're fixated on my skin, but more in the sense of if I were pale, you know, if I were someone who were African American but super pale, you know, I would still want my Blackness and that heritage to be recognized. They're all rich parts of what, you know, like what we
Yeah.
say, like, you know?
Yeah.
And to ignore that would be just as problematic. And in terms of racism, can be just as dangerous when people are not willing to recognize the struggles that do come with looking this way in the world.
Yeah, that's beautiful explanation. I love how you balance that we shouldn't completely ignore the fact that you're Black, you're Latina, you're Jewish. Recognize the differences and the beauty of those differences, and not use it in a negative way. Don't use the differences in a way like to separate us, but use the differences to bring us together. That we are different, but we are also the same. We are part of the human species. We are all part of humanity.
Yeah.
And all the different colors and religions and identities can all come together for one goal, right? To serve humanity. So I love that. I love what you said about that. That's very interesting. Yafi, so how did you experience any racism when you came to Israel? And was it different from what you experienced in Hollywood?
Yes and no. Um, to be honest, I've been living in Israel now for about 7 years. And the 7 years I've been living here, I personally, and huge dagesh on I personally, because I have many friends who live here who would not be saying the same thing, and Dafka would be saying the opposite of what I'm about to say. But I personally haven't experienced so much racism in Israel. I have experienced much more in America. And to be
Mm,
honest, when I go back and visit communities in America, I usually do have some encounter or another. I think it's also important to put this caveat here right now, which is that not every encounter that is a racist encounter is a malicious one,
Yeah.
which I think is a really important distinction to make. And I think it's something that's very hard for people to understand and swallow. And I think like as Jews, we can very much so think about anti-Semitism when it comes to the statement. Like, you know, not every single time when you run into something that is anti-Semitic is it malicious or dangerous physically in that moment. Sometimes it's a small comment about like, you know, like you're with your friends and you pick up the pennies and they're like, oh, like classic you, like, you know, like you probably learned that at home. It's not a dangerous comment, but
Thank you for
it's
making that distinction.
it's rude and it's anti-Semitic, you know, like did that person probably intend to be snide? Like sometimes yes, you know, like if you're dealing with someone like that, then perhaps they were trying to like, you know, slip that comment underneath there. But more often than not with good humans, and I'd like to believe that most of us are trying to be good people in this world, they don't mean it in that way, but they've been fed a certain narrative that it's hard for them to pass.
Or
And
it could be from ignorance.
or from ignorance, yeah.
A lot of it's from ignorance.
And therefore it's very hard sometimes for people to even see that, and it makes it harder to therefore educate them and call them out on that, you know, because like in that example, for example, like it'd be very hard to tell your friend like, oh, you know, that comment was kind of anti-Semitic. It's easy to explain why, but it might be very hard to put it in a way that they would understand that, you know, making a small comment about you picking up the change off of the Starbucks receipt that you just paid for with your own money, like, no, like it's not because I'm a Jew, it's just because I'm saving money, you know? Like the fact that you decided to attach an anti-Semitic trope to the fact that I am picking up my loose change, that's on you, and that's something you need to work on. So I think it's very important to make that distinction that not every single thing that I'm talking about when I say dealing with racism means that someone was calling me the N-word or telling me that some disgusting thing. Oftentimes I find, and this is honestly the reason why I continue to talk about this, because I think this is, at least in the Jewish world, the most important type of racism to combat. It's the subtle things. It's the things that I don't even think the people recognize when they're doing it. And as a result, it becomes very uncomfortable and difficult to call them out on that, or not even call them out, to explain to them, you know? I think that you catch a lot more flies with honey than you do vinegar, or whatever the saying is. And even when trying to explain something privately and, you know, very sensitively to someone, it's still very hard a lot of times for people to take that in, because in 2021, no one wants to be called a racist. And I think when people hear that anything they've done could be racist, they automatically throw up a shield. And no, it's not. No, it's not. My family went through lots of trials and tribulations and has dealt with a lot of bigotry, anti-Semitism, whatever it is. You know, my family was poor, like, I can't be racist. And it's like, that's not the case. Like, that's not how it works. You know, like there could be someone who suffered greatly and they could still be doing negative things to other people, you know, like a Black person who has experienced great racism could still be discriminating against someone who is from China, you know, like, and same too, like we as Jews can still be discriminating against other people, even if we have gone through terrible, terrible things in our families or in our histories.
I think that was a very big part of the argument that was going on a couple months ago when this whole George Floyd incident was going on, where certain people were saying that Jewish people have Jewish privilege, white privilege, and that we have to look within and face our racism. And then other people were like, I'm not racist. Why are you calling me racist? And to be honest, I was one of the people that I felt like attacked when I was going on someone's stories and they were like, face your inner racism. I'm like, how am I racist? Why are you calling me racist? And I felt like I needed to defend myself. But here you're telling me that there is a nuance. It's not like blatant racism that just comes out very, you know, obviously. It's subtle. It's like the little things, like, you know, when someone passes by you and just an automatic stereotype you might have about someone who's Chinese or Indian or whatever it is, Persian. I'm a Persian Jew. I'm sure when I tell people I'm Persian, they're like, automatically, they just switch. Their brains must switch. Oh, you're Persian? So you're like this. You're cheap. You're loud. You're a gossiper. Whatever it is. So thank you
And
for making that.
oftentimes, like, if you were to call someone out for saying any of those things that you just mentioned right now, they might be like, oh, it's just a joke. I don't actually think you're a gossip, but it's like, no, like you're feeding into that stereotypes that Persians are X and like we are not, like I'm not Persian, but
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
editorial we. And I think that's something that a lot of people really, really struggle with, like really struggle with. No one
Yeah.
wants to be called a bigot of any kind in today's day and age.
Of course
It
not.
is very passe. It is very not okay. It's not cool. And people get incredibly defensive. And look, we all have that, like
Yeah.
there are things that I am ignorant about that I'm sure I have fumbled and made mistakes on and made people feel uncomfortable or upset about. And it's very possible that if they called me out on it, I would be like, I totally didn't mean it like that. But the difference is that I think we all, like as a whole, like it doesn't matter if you're white, black, Jewish, anything, like as a whole, I think us human beings in today's day and age really need to work on being able to take a step back and recognize that perhaps you're not in that person's shoes. You don't understand their culture or their whatever, and that most people on the planet usually have something that they could draw upon to be able to understand another person's struggle.
Yeah.
And that even if it seems ridiculous, like God forbid, like your struggle seems so much more terrible because I don't know, like you
Yeah.
lost like your grandfather at a young, not you, of course, the
Yeah.
editorial,
Yeah.
but you lost your grandfather at a very young age, and like this person's crying like over something else that they lost, and you're like, that's so small, that's
Yeah.
not a grandparent. And they're like, how are you doing, like, and then like you meet someone else like years later who looks at your pain of the loss of your grandfather when they lost their sibling, and they look at you like, that's so small. Like we all have something that we could draw upon, that we could either use it to say, no, your pain is not as great as mine, my pain is worse. But there will always be someone else who has a greater pain who can look at us and say the same, and
Yeah.
that's wrong. It's
Yeah.
so wrong. We don't appreciate it. It's not helpful, and honestly it just leads to more strife down the line, and it has throughout history.
There has to be less comparison, like comparative victimhood. I'm the greater victim. We went through the Holocaust. We went through all the pogroms. We went through all of this, and more just you using your experience in history to be more empathetic towards someone else's struggle. And I think as Jewish people, we have a responsibility to to be empathetic and compassionate towards other people's struggles, other people's identities, and really feel their pain, because we were also strangers in a land. And it says in the Torah, because we were strangers in the land, we have to treat the stranger well. We have to treat them with respect and dignity and understand their experience and be inclusive. And I think there needs to be more conversation and more, talking to each other and listening, as opposed to just, dictating what my politics are, what my what's it called? I'm losing my words. I'm very tired right now. What my passions are about the topic, and instead of like drilling it down someone and they're like it goes one ear out the other, instead of having a conversation, trying to educate people without being dogmatic. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the biggest thing that I've really seen over this past summer is that the people on all sides, whether it was people I was speaking to who were Black and not Jewish, or people I was speaking to who were Jewish and not Black, there are people I spoke to who were crossovers of all those things, but specifically those two groups, I found that when I was able to speak to them in a way that showed that I was actually listening and caring about what they were saying, all of a sudden they cared a lot more about what I was saying.
Yes.
And I think that's the biggest thing. Like, we don't need to make this like it was very hard for me to see like pockets in the Jewish world making this like an us versus them thing.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
we don't need to make this an us versus them thing. Like, we're both minorities in the world, or at least in America specifically.
Yeah.
And we lean on one another, like my father always used to say that like Jews care a lot more about like the plight of Black people in America, and Black people in America should care a lot more about the plight of Jews and what we have to go through with anti-Semitism. And I know that a lot of people then like to jump up and say, oh, but they're not caring about us and about our community, and their anti-Semitic attacks, like, you know, like they're this or they're that, and like they don't care or they're even happy. And to that I say, I know so many Black people who say the exact same thing about racism about Jews, and that breaks my heart. And when I've been able to speak to people who are genuinely willing to listen, and I think that's the biggest thing, being really willing to listen. And it's hard. It is very hard when you feel like you've been attacked or you have a certain narrative in your head about a certain group, to speak to someone who is part of that group, part of that world, and to actually try to open yourself up, and to actually open yourself up also to hear what they're saying is very difficult. But I found that when people have been able to do that over the summer, beautiful things happen. Maybe people aren't automatically changed like that overnight, but there's so much more understanding and patience and eureka moments in conversations where people were like, Jews told me, wow, I didn't realize that Black people had gone through XYZ. I thought that they were doing XYZ because, and fill in the blank with whatever thing they had been told or assumed growing up. And the same with Black people I spoke to about things that Jews go through in America today, and they didn't recognize or realize as well. Right. And I just think it's such a pity when we're not able to do that. And I know it's hard. I know it's so hard, but I think, like I said, my Jewish identity is probably the biggest part of me. I think it's such, I don't want to say Chilul Hashem because that feels like almost a little too strong, but like in that direction, when instead of making a friend, we push people away further, you know? Like when it comes to Limud Torah, like we make it very clear that like we're not a religion, like, you know, that says like, no, don't ask questions. Like we're a religion that encourages the questions. Why? Because like we want to draw people in, we want to bring them in, like, you know, like the kid who's struggling in yeshiva, like, you know, like you don't shut him down, like you let him ask his questions to draw him into, like, you know, what his like learning, and like hopefully that'll like, you know, grow into desire to be like closer and to understand more and everything. And I think that's the exact same way like Hashem showed us that that's how we should treat people.
That's true. That's beautiful. So I was asking you a question before, but obviously we got into a very interesting conversation. Do you feel like in Israel, because, you know, it's a democratic country, and they're very advanced and progressive in many ways, do you feel like the Jewish people in Israel are less racist or more racist against Black people? What has your experience been like?
I didn't hear the full question. It cut out for a hot sec there.
Oh, sorry about that. So what has your experience been like in Israel in regards to racism? Do you feel like the Jews in Israel are more or less racist than Jewish people in America?
So I don't think it's a more or less thing. And like I said, on this topic, you will find so many different opinions from people who are Jews of color to people who are Jews of color. People have varying opinions, so this is wholly mine. No one go and take this as the universal opinion of people of color, Jews of color specifically. But I personally find that it's not that there's less racism, it's just that it takes a different form in the Jewish world than Israel.
Yeah, can you tell us how?
I've said this many times, and it still stands till today for me. What I have experienced is that in America, for example, when I come into a new community, there's this like vetting period. Now, the vetting period might only be a few hours, or it could stretch to months. And I know that for some people, in their case, it has even been years, which is incredibly painful. But it's like this like very politically correct, like American trying to like, you know, like find things out without like directly asking, like, how are you Jewish? Like, you know, like people will like, and I've had a lot of people say like, oh, well, they were just asking questions. And oftentimes when I've been in new places, I'm usually there with other people. I haven't really ever been in a situation where I've been in a new Jewish community by myself. And my friends or my husband usually won't get quite the same questions that I'll get of like, oh, where was your mother born? Oh,
Yeah.
what community she grew up in? Like, oh, interesting. And where did your father learn? Oh, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and people will try to like surreptitiously find out like, how am I Jewish? Where did I convert? They assume that I did convert, which I didn't.
Yeah.
And how Jewish am I? Like, do I really understand things? But I found that once you get past that hurdle of the vetting period, that then all of a sudden they stop seeing your blackness and it's just like, oh, you're just like the Jew in the community, which on the one hand is very nice to feel accepted. On the other hand, it does go back to all the things that we were talking about earlier of like, like when you ignore something about a person completely, like you're also ignoring things that they might be struggling with that come along with that, or insensitive things you might be doing that are therefore hurting that person in your community. So that's what I found. Whereas in Israel, it's totally not like that. In Israel, when I walk into a new community, a new shul, a new organization, a new whatever, like no one bats an eye, like in America, like sometimes I'll walk into a Jewish space, a restaurant even. I went to a restaurant in Brooklyn with my family and we were turning heads.
Yeah.
Turning heads. Lots of open mouths and staring and whispering. Like that doesn't happen in Israel.
Yeah.
Which on the one hand is nice, because it feels at least like automatic acceptance because no one seems to really have a problem with who you are. However, what I found in Israel is that I'm not usually getting questions about how am I Jewish or if I'm Jewish. It's usually just assumed that I am. However, people will usually attach assumptions to me. And it's really hard for Israelis to kind of like work back from those assumptions. Like
what kind of assumptions?
So right now it's winter, so I'm a little bit paler, but in the summer I get a lot tanner, a lot darker. And I mean, now I'm married, so I cover my hair and it's different, but whatever. When I didn't cover my hair is curly.
Yeah.
And people, if my hair, for example, was messy and I didn't brush my hair that day and it was like in a bun in a rat's nest and I was really dark and it's in the summer, then I get Ethiopian.
Right.
Sometimes I'll get Indian. In the winter, sometimes I would get French, Brazilian, Filipino, like literally like any place in the world that has people of color, there might be a chance that I have been asked if I am from that place before.
Right.
And Israelis don't really ask, they just assume that you're from that place. And I remember where we were living previously, there were multiple times that we'd go somewhere and like there would be no questions, but at a certain point, like, something about Ethiopians, for example, would come up and they would be like, oh, Yaffy, like, like you must know about this. And I'm like,
oh my God.
I don't. And they're like, what do you mean? Like, and I'm like, I don't know, like, like injera, like, like it's a bread that Ethiopians make. It's like a flatbread. And I've tried it once in my life and it was at Nishmat. It was Yom Hasid, which is like an Ethiopian holiday. And I was just like, I don't know how to make injera. I'm really sorry. I've never made it in my life. I don't have a recipe for you. And then they're like, what, but you're Ethiopian. And then you have to explain, not Ethiopian. They're like, how could it be that you're not Ethiopian? And it's like, well, there are Jews of color who are not X, whatever it is that they assume that I was from. So I think it just depended on a person's personality, what they prefer. Some people might find that like vetting period, if you want to call it that in America, very alienating and too difficult and very abrasive and not something that they're okay with. And they would prefer to deal with like, the automatic acceptance that you feel like you get in Israel. For other people, they might prefer like, to have people vet them, to have to prove their Judaism in some way or another, and then to move on with their life and not have to deal with like the assumptions that might pop up living in Israel. All in all, I think this, like, for me, goes back to what my dad said about like the so what about skin color, and how I was like, it's not about not seeing color, but it's about recognizing that like sometimes as a person who's different, you have to walk through life to others' reactions saying, so what, like if every person who was experiencing bigotry let that define them, like they would crumble. No matter what kind of bigotry that is. Like you need
we
to
always
be
define ourselves. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, continue.
I was saying if we defined ourselves as Jewish based on anti-Semitism, that wouldn't be a pleasant identity, to identify with. So yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, for me, it's like, these are the biggest parts of my identity. And when I run into problems with people, I just tell myself, so what? It's on them. Like, if they're interested in getting to know me and knowing more about my Judaism or my Blackness or my Latino culture, like, awesome. And if they're not, and if they have preconceived notions that they're not willing to even remotely challenge, so what?
Yeah. Okay. So how did you meet your husband? Because that's very interesting. Was that your husband is white?
Yeah.
And you guys met in Israel. Were there any obstacles along the way when you guys met? And did he have any preconceived notions, or was it just like, I'm getting to know you? I don't see color. I see Yaffy.
Yeah.
How did that go?
So this is our Shabbos table story, so I'll tell the abridged version because it's quite,
Okay.
when you come for Shabbos in Jerusalem one day, we'll tell you guys the whole story.
Okay, fine.
But my husband and I met actually the summer right before I came for my year in Israel. So like 2 months before I flew to Israel again to start my year, I came to Israel on a summer program, and we literally like bumped into each other like two strangers, like like you're walking down Ben Yehuda and like someone bumps into you and you talk for 2 minutes, like like that kind of experience. He definitely did have assumptions. I say it was because of my skin color. He says that it wasn't. Whatever, every how we met story has its machlokas.
Yeah.
And we went on with our lives, two strangers met for 2 seconds. And then when I came back from my year in Israel, the last night of Slichot, I wanted to go to the Kotel with my roommate. I had never been in Israel during the Chagim, so I had no idea that Slichot at the Kotel was like an event, and that like
Right.
literal tens of thousands of people pour from every area of Israel to the Kotel. It was pretty late at night, and we were like, oh, it's going to be so spiritual, like us alone at the Kotel, like totally was not us alone at the Kotel. Very spiritual, but not in the way we had anticipated. And I was walking, and I'm very proud of my religious identity, but I'm definitely not. My mother is more of a very spiritually connected person, I'd say, like sees all the little hidden things and everything. I'm not, like, I'm a little bit more of like a different kind of connection to my religious side. And we were walking, and it was super late at night, very dark, already walking down to the Kotel. It was like shoulder to shoulder, like everyone's on top of you, super packed. And I look up, and like 10 feet in front of me, I see like this guy's back of his head. And like I told my roommate, I was like, Haley, I was like, we have to go bump into that guy. Like I need to see his face. Like there's just something about him.
Wow.
And mind you, like when I met my husband for 2 seconds, we like literally met for 2 seconds. It was late at night. Like I was tired. Like he also like he had a totally different haircut and look, everything. Like, and my husband's back of his head, while very special to me, is pretty nondescript. Like he has dark brown hair, like like nothing particularly distinctive. And I was like, Racheli, we have to get there. She obviously told me I was crazy because I did sound crazy. And we got up to where he was after a lot of Israeli elbowing and pushing. And I accidentally bumped into him.
Accidentally.
Exactly. And he turned around, and he says that he turned around to like yell, like being the Israeli that he is, like Matosari, like whatever. And he looked at me and he's like, you look really familiar. And I was like, you look really familiar. And we talked all the way down until we got to the Kotel. We figured it out. We did not actually start dating then because I was a good Sem girl. Once I decided to come for Sem, I was like, that's it. I'm studying. Like, I'm not dealing with like anything else. He asked me out. I said, no, whatever. It's a long story, but we ended up dating eventually later on that year. And we dated for a few years through his army service and got married in the middle of that.
In the middle of his army service.
Yeah.
Wow. And your family came to Israel for the wedding and everything?
Yeah, for everything. Yeah.
But was it easy to just get together? How did that play out?
So in terms of us personally, it was very easy. Like there was no things.
Yeah.
But about like 2 or 3 months into dating, My husband's yeshiva had like a rule that like you have to leave cell phones outside the base. And so he was like very stark in his like, you know, like yeshiva time, and like he would learn until like 1 o'clock in the morning, and then like he'd call me to say goodnight. It's very cute.
Yeah, that's so
And
cute.
so he like called me like early one night, and I was like surprised to hear from him. I thought something was wrong. I was like, Nadav, like, you know, like you're calling me early, did something happened? And he's like, Yaffy, he's like, it just hit me. And I was like, what? And he's like, we're an interracial couple. And I was like, yeah, like,
Right.
was that not obvious to begin with? And he was like, no, I don't know. Like, I just like, it never like, I never processed it. And I was like, okay. So I would say he very much so was like, didn't see color.
Yeah.
We, Baruch Hashem, never had any issues in our relationship or in our families,
Thank
like
God.
coming together, which I know is not the story of many people
Yeah.
with given my background. But I will definitely say that like there definitely has been like a learning curve, you know, like
Yeah.
my husband, like any person, you know, like didn't walk in my shoes all his life, so he doesn't
Yeah.
understand all the things I understand about being a person of color. And there definitely were instances where like, you know, like he might share something and like I would like explain why like I totally didn't agree with that perspective, and there are like a lot of like aha moments like in the beginning where he'd be like, wow, like I didn't recognize that it felt that way. I know also meeting my father as well, because I'm not really an activist. Like I've just been talking about this because like the Jewish community is home for me, and like I want
Yeah.
our community to be the best that we can be. My father was very much an activist though, and like my husband got into tons of conversations, hours upon hours with my dad, and I know that like really opened up his eyes because he, like many Jews who grew up in the frum world, he
Yeah.
was not exposed to so many American Jews of color growing up. He had a lot of Ethiopian friends, but they don't have the same background, very different history, very
Yeah.
different background, also experienced a lot of racism, but there's a
Yeah.
different culture there, you know, like to mush all Jews of color who are Black into the same boat is like
Yes.
not correct. Like we don't have
Yeah.
the same struggles. We may have a lot of similar ones, but we don't all have the exact identical ones. And not this past summer, but recently when we were in New York, we did a meal at one of my brother's houses in Brooklyn for Shabbos. And my brother, like my father was very into like, you know, opening his home for Shabbos. If anyone needs a place, come, like you'll eat by us, whatever. And what was supposed to be like a 10-person meal, which already was like very big for like their Brooklyn apartment, ended up being like an almost 30-person meal. And it
Wow.
was like the week that like there was like citywide blackouts, and it was
Oh my
like
God.
it was terrible, whatever. But the point is that everyone at the table was a Jew of color. There was not one
Oh,
Caucasian person there. And I didn't think anything of it because
right.
I'm so used to walking in my Jewish spaces throughout the world, being the only one who looks like me, that like I didn't even think of what my husband must feel like being the only one who looks like him.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when we walked out of that meal, he looked at me and he was like, I get it now. He's like,
Wow.
he's like, now that I get it, I understand how much I didn't get it. He's like,
Wow.
thought that I got it.
I
I
just got
thought that
goosebumps.
and it gave me goosebumps because like it's such
Wow.
a powerful sentence that I don't think so many of us realize. Like until you get it, you don't get it. And we can be very arrogant as human beings. I myself can be very arrogant and am sometimes, and try to work on that. But sometimes it's hard until you realize how much so you made assumptions and thought you got it. And he's like, I can't imagine what it must always be like, that's your always, you know, like
Yeah.
you are always the one who looks different and who is separate from everyone else, and noticeably so. And no one at the meal cared about my husband's skin color. Like
Right.
no one said
Right.
anything about it. It wasn't a topic of conversation. It wasn't like it came up, but he felt so outsider, so
Yeah.
other. And he's like, I can't believe this is what you go through life feeling like. And I was like, it's fine, it's okay. But
Wow.
yeah, it's different. It's
Wow. As a biracial couple, as you said, do you feel like people just accept you guys? Did you get any heat from that? From like, not from like family or anything, but like when you guys walk in together, You don't get any stares that you're a biracial couple, a Jewish biracial couple in Israel?
So in Israel, not so much. We have gotten like a little bit of looks and whatnot sometimes when we travel in America.
Yeah.
In Israel, not so much, but I will say that sometimes it's just because people like, like a biracial couple isn't so wild anymore in Israel. Like, by the time that we hopefully our children are having children, it will be like not even something that people even think to talk about because it'll be so normal. And it's definitely starting to become a lot more normal here. Like, I don't feel like we're like the odd ones out, but I will definitely say that we definitely did used to, like 6 years ago, like when our first year of dating, we did get a lot of looks.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was specific that year or if things have really changed so drastically since then, but we were getting a lot of looks. Never any like actual confrontation, but definitely looks. And something that does still happen is a lot of times, like, for example, like, Mom, don't listen to this wherever you are. But when we were living in a yeshuv, so we would sometimes tramp back home. I know to Americans that's crazy. It's very different here. Not
Wait,
saying that things
wait,
can't
what
be
would you
dangerous.
do? I didn't hear you.
Tramp,
What does
hitchhike.
that mean? Oh, hitchhike. Oh my God.
Stick your finger out. That's just like the normal way that people travel back home. The bus doesn't come. You take like whatever. There's like designated spots and whatever, and like some people do it more extreme. We did it on like the very baby way, but we were standing in like a very accepted spot to hitchhike home. And many times when we get in the car together, especially if it was like, from couple, then they would say like, like let the girl sit in the front or let the girl sit in the back, wherever it was, so that, like, guys aren't on top of girls, whatever. It's Israel, it's
Uh-huh.
cute, like,
Right.
And
So
so there were definitely fun times like we'd get into the car together and like they'd be like, oh, like let her sit up front, or like, let him sit up front, and he'd be like, this is my wife, and they're like,
oh my
oh.
God, right. They didn't think you guys would actually be together, just like random people
Yeah.
taking a hitchhike together.
Yeah, but like, listen, like it's par for the course, like things change, and change often comes slowly when it's really monumental change. And if these are the things that I have to deal with, and in the hopes that one day when my children are my age that they won't have to deal with it, or that it's significantly less, bring it on.
Bring
Like,
it on. Love it.
more than
So
happy to do the work now. So.
beautiful. Yaffy, I have one last question for you. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for your time and for teaching me and anyone who's listening so much about the experience of a Black Latina Jewish woman. And it's not black and white, excuse the pun. It's not so black and white. There's so much nuance in the conversation, and there's so much getting to know a person. And I really listened to you with an open mind. I feel like in the beginning of this, I was like so defensive, and I'm like, no, I'm not racist. Like, how dare people call me racist? And I'm learning here, it's not really about like people telling me I'm racist. It's more like open your mind and just see the experience of another human being and their struggles of what they have been going through. Because I definitely went through struggles myself with my identity, and picture that. So I want to thank you for opening my eyes and for helping me see another element of this. I really want to thank you for that. So my last question for you, since this is an episode about Aliyah and living in Israel, what do you love most about living in Israel?
Wow. That's a loaded one. How do you pick
Yeah,
one thing? Um, what do I love most?
I know. Sometimes I have loaded questions.
It's a good one though. I think for me, it will definitely have to be the sort of lifestyle that we're able to have um, here. I know that something that we didn't quite talk about, but that like I alluded to, is that like I personally really feel like I found myself religiously in Israel I did grow up from, like, you know, I grew up Shomer Shabbos and Kashrus and the whole 9 yards, but like it just felt like the thing that I was doing. Yes, I'm Jewish and I believe in Hashem and all of that, but like it felt tired and uninspired for me. Not that American Jewry is like, my connection at that time with Judaism felt very tired.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt like something that of course I would continue on in life and I would raise my children in, but I didn't have this like fire in me. And there are so many little varied communities within every religious bubble, you know, like my friends will sometimes try to like categorize me and they're like, oh, so you're Datiro me, you're this, you're that. And I'm like, yeah, but like, you know, like if you don't live here, then it's hard to understand like all the different little pockets and like different communities. But like the religious expression spectrum is so huge, and I just feel like I'm able to like express my avodat Hashem to the fullest. Not that it's always easy. I'm not saying that I'm always 100% connected, you know, like, oh, like I'm living like, you know, my best spiritual life 100% of the time. Not at all. Just like any person anywhere in the world, there are ups and downs. But I just feel like I found myself here religiously in a way that I was never able to do anywhere else. And I love seeing that when I can see that in other people, you know, when we go someplace for Shabbos and it's like, wow, this just feels like home, you know, like even if we're not identical, like there are shared values, be it religious, social, whatever. And knowing that like there are places where I can go and feel like these people get me in every way, you know. So yeah, I would definitely have to say my religious expression.
Beautiful, Yaffy. Beautiful. Wow, I want to go to Israel right now. Beautiful.
Come for Shabbos.
God willing,
We'll
one day
you
let us
guys.
come into the country, Yaffy. But I feel like I feel like you just gave me the theme of your podcast, of your episode. I'll tell you about it later. You just rounded up the episode for me. Yaffy, Yaffy, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you and they want to learn more about perhaps making Aliyah or just connecting with you and talking about racism and all those other issues?
For sure. I am on Instagram. I'm sure you could drop my handle. It's
Yes.
Yaffy. Just the first 3 letters of both of my names. And yeah, I'm not always so active on there because of school and life, but when I am, I really love meeting people on there because, you know, wouldn't have met you otherwise. And look at this beautiful connection. So
well, I'm blessed to have made this connection with you, and I'm sure anyone else who connects with you is going to feel that bracha in their lives. Thank you so much, Yaffy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.